Hello historians, welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Prof. J and I am your history professor. In today's lesson, we're going to be diving into the Second World War. We'll begin with how the war started in both Europe and Asia. We'll examine in Europe the moves that Adolf Hitler made that led to the beginning of war and how he was able to get away with those moves. And in Asia, we'll look at the expansion of the Japanese and how the war started there. We'll then move to a summary of the progress of World War II, looking at the war and some of its main events from 1937 to 45 in Asia and from 1939 to 45 in Europe. We'll examine some of the important battles of World War II, such as the Battle of Stalingrad, the D-Day invasions of Europe, Pearl Harbor, and the battles of Midway Island and the Coral Sea. We'll examine the toll that the war took on civilians with an extended look at the Holocaust, as well as some of the firebombing campaigns against Japanese cities. And then finally, we'll bring the war to a close with the invasion and eventual defeat of the Nazis, as well as the use of atomic weapons against Japan. That's a lot of stuff that we have to cover today, so without further ado, it is, as always, time for history, so let's get started. Hello historians, and welcome to World War II. Today we're going to examine the causes of the Second World War, how the war began and progressed in Europe, the ways in which it became a global conflict, what was happening on the home front, and the toll taken on civilians during the war before we finally bring it to a close. There are four main causes of the Second World War: the Treaty of Versailles and the reaction to it, the failure to keep the international peace, various economic crises, and lastly, the rise of violent nationalism. The Paris Peace Conference held after World War I had created many new nations, including Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and the Baltic states, among others. Although the crafters of the peace wanted to respect the idea of various groups of people obtaining their own state, realistically, such lines could not be drawn. This led to some states, such as Yugoslavia, being a mixture of many different ethnic groups, not all of which got along. Ethnic and religious tension led to minorities being persecuted, with their only aid the goodwill and strength of powers like England and France. But as we'll see momentarily, those powers had little interest or ability to help. Additionally, if you recall from our lesson on World War I, the Treaty of Versailles put the blame for starting the war on Germany's shoulders, and used that as a pretext to impose war reparations on the country. Despite attempts during the 1920s to reduce the payments and ease the financial burden, many Germans were upset about having to pay damages to France, England, and others. To compound the problem, part of Germany was occupied when it failed to make a reparations payment to France, which made the German people feel weak and helpless. As we discussed in our last lesson on the interwar period, these feelings were taken advantage of by Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, who talked a big game about making Germany strong and giving Germans pride in their nation once again. A second cause for World War II was the inability of international organizations like the League of Nations to handle the problems Europe was experiencing. As ethnic and religious tensions began to boil, the unwillingness of Britain and France to intervene allowed these tensions to increase. Also, had the League of Nations been a stronger organization, it may have been able to stand up to Hitler as he began to expand Germany into other territories, a development to be discussed later. Thirdly, economic catastrophe across Europe didn't help the situation. As we saw in the previous lesson, German reparations payments led to the printing of more money, which only caused hyperinflation and wiped out many people's savings. After a brief revival in the mid-1920s, the Great Depression spread to Europe and led to millions becoming unemployed across the continent. These economic problems, combined with the already existing anger in places like Germany and Italy due to World War I and the Paris Peace Conference, led many to turn to extreme ideologies like fascism and Nazism for answers. Those answers normally came in the shape of violating international laws and agreements. In Germany, Hitler shredded the Treaty of Versailles and began rearming his country, which provided jobs to millions of German citizens. Italy, meanwhile, sought to create an empire abroad, invading Ethiopia in 1935 as a distraction from the economic difficulties the nation was going through. Rearmament and imperialism bring us to the final cause for World War II: a rise in violent, militant nationalism. Many nations experienced this in the 1930s, not just Italy and Germany. In Spain, a civil war broke out between supporters of the Spanish Republic and right-wing nationalists who controlled the military. In Japan, militant political parties took over the government and laid plans for Japan to conquer all of Asia, because they felt they were inherently superior. Yugoslavia, Poland, and Romania also came under the leadership of violent nationalists. Even France and the United States saw the emergence of Nazi parties that garnered support. All of these nationalists were violent and willing to use violence to achieve their goals. Many of them were also anti-Semitic, which would spell danger for Europe's Jewish population once the war began. All of them were anti-democratic, believing that a single, strong leader of a single political party was a better system than one built on consensus and compromise. In the early 1930s, there were many political leaders willing to appease these nationalists, meaning they were willing to give them much of what they wanted in return for peace. Some supported appeasement because of memories of how devastating World War I was, and there was widespread revulsion to the thought of another worldwide conflict. Some supported appeasement because they felt some, such as Germany under Adolf Hitler, had legitimate grievances, such as the Rhineland being made into a demilitarized zone or having to pay reparations payments. After all, weren't attempts in the 1920s to ease those payments evidence that perhaps the Treaty of Versailles had gone too far? Others supported appeasement due to fear and hatred of communism. These folks believed states like fascist Italy and Nazi Germany could be used as a bulwark against the spread of communism. Some perhaps even dreamed of a situation in which communists, fascists, and Nazis all destroyed each other, leaving their nations open for reform along democratic, capitalist lines. Events in the early to mid-1930s severely tested and undermined the policy of appeasement. In 1931, a Japanese railroad in the northern Chinese province of Manchuria was bombed. Japan promptly blamed China for terrorism and launched a full invasion of Manchuria, despite the fact, only discovered after the war ended, that Japan had bombed its own railroad as a pretext for the invasion. The United States, which had trade deals with Japan, expressed concern over this event, but decided to appease Japan. As the most economically and technologically powerful nation in Asia, Japan was best suited to defend other Asian nations against communism, which had already made inroads in China. This appeasement only led to more conflict, with an official declaration of war between the two powers coming in 1937. That same year, a massive Japanese invasion force succeeded in taking the Chinese capital of Nanking. For 6 weeks, Japanese troops committed horrible atrocities against civilians and troops in what's become known as the Rape of Nanking. As previously mentioned, in 1935, Italy invaded the eastern African nation of Ethiopia. The League of Nations condemned the invasion, but had no means to stop it from happening. Nations like England, France, and the United States did nothing to help the Ethiopian people. Finally, in 1936, civil war broke out in Spain between the Republic and nationalist forces under General Francisco Franco. Both Italy and Germany sent aid to the nationalist forces, while Joseph Stalin sent aid to communist groups fighting for the Republic. While individual Americans signed up to fight for the Republic on their own volition, democratic governments shied away from the war. France's Leon Blum believed getting involved in another war would lead to his government toppling. Meanwhile, Italy, Germany, and the Soviet Union used the war as a test ground for new technologies and battle tactics. The war cost some 500,000 lives, many of them civilians, who were targeted by Nazi bombers as they attacked cities like Guernica in northern Spain. In 1939, Franco's militarist forces won the war, and Franco stayed in power until his death in 1975. Hitler learned a valuable lesson with the Spanish Civil War. Britain and France were so war-averse that they would not stand up to his aggressive moves if he threatened them with conflict. The failure of the appeasement policy was made clear by Hitler during the mid to late 1930s. In 1933, he removed Germany from the League of Nations, which it had joined 8 years earlier. In 1935, Hitler began openly rearming, as well as conscription and military training. In 1936, he moved troops into the demilitarized Rhineland, despite these being clear violations of the Treaty of Versailles. Britain and France allowed them to happen. The same year, Hitler moved his troops into the Austrian capital of Vienna and annexed the country, meaning it was now part of Germany. This was also a violation of the Versailles Treaty, but again, Britain and France allowed it. Austria had a large Nazi party, and many Austrians seemed quite happy to become part of Germany, something Hitler used against Britain and France, arguing that the Austrian people had spoken and wanted to be a part of Germany. So who were the Western powers to deny those people their self-determination? In 1938, Hitler claimed the Sudetenland should become a part of Germany as well. This was a part of Czechoslovakia that bordered Germany. The Czech army was small but tough and well-disciplined. Czechoslovakia was also one of the few Central European nations that remained democratic through the interwar period, and they were willing to fight for that democracy. They also had strong border defenses and munitions factories close by, so they could easily resupply their army. There were, however, 3 million German people living in the Sudetenland, and Hitler's propaganda focused on them, claiming they were being persecuted and abused by their government, and that they should be living in a country ruled by Germans. However, instead of asking the entire population to be moved into Germany, Hitler demanded that Germany's borders expand to include the Sudetenland. He also applied the lesson he learned in the Spanish Civil War and threatened armed conflict if he did not get what he wanted. Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain called for a conference to settle the issue. At the Munich conference, Britain, France, and Italy and Germany discussed the situation and what to do about it. Notice that Czechoslovakia was not invited to this conference, despite it being about their land. Once again, appeasement won the day, and the Sudetenland was given to Hitler, along with all of the stationary defenses and anything else, including munitions factories, that could not be removed. France and Britain had essentially sold out a potential ally. The supposed peace created by the Munich conference didn't last long. For 6 months later, Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, now defenseless after losing the Sudetenland. This action demonstrated that Hitler would not be appeased, and anything Britain and France gave him would only prompt him to demand more. Both nations began ramping up arms production and promised to ensure the security of nations like Poland. It's time for the first review of this lesson. First, the Second World War began for 4 main reasons: the Treaty of Versailles and the reaction to it, the failure to maintain peace internationally, economic crises, and violent nationalism. Second, some in Western democratic nations favored a policy of appeasing leaders like Adolf Hitler, in part due to aversion to another world war. Finally, Hitler and Italy's Benito Mussolini took advantage of the policy of appeasement by getting involved in the Spanish Civil War invading Ethiopia, and claiming the Sudetenland. Hitler's moves also caused a new round of negotiations between the Western powers and the Soviet Union. The purpose of the negotiations was to get Stalin to agree to engage Germany in a two-front war against England, France, and Russia, just as they had in the First World War. However, Stalin had also seen the weakness of France and Great Britain demonstrated during the Spanish Civil War, and doubted their readiness to fight an aggressive Germany with Italy alongside it. He also wasn't keen on helping protect Poland, whose territory Stalin wanted to expand into. Simultaneously, Stalin's foreign minister was negotiating with his German counterpart. To just about everyone's surprise, the two nations agreed to a non-aggression pact in 1939. Hitler secured his eastern border from Soviet attack and could therefore concentrate his war to the west, while Stalin bought time to finish rebuilding his military, especially the officer corps, which, if you'll recall from the previous lesson, was purged of anyone not loyal to Stalin. Secret provisions in the agreement also allowed Stalin to take the eastern half of Poland, as well as the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Appeasement had been the wrong move, and things were looking bad for France and Britain. And they were about to get worse. On September 1st, 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland and captured most of the country in 4 weeks. The Nazi attack consisted of coordinated air and land assaults with fast-moving divisions of tanks followed by infantry. These blitzkrieg attacks were devastating and quickly overwhelmed the Polish resistance. After the Nazi attack began, the secret provisions of the deal with Stalin were enacted, and the Soviets overran the eastern portion of Poland and moved into the Baltic nations. France and Britain spent the winter months preparing for war, and in spring of 1940, the Nazi onslaught resumed, taking Denmark in a single day and invading Norway. Next, Belgium and the Netherlands fell before Nazi armies moved into France. 300,000 British and French troops had to be evacuated in an emergency operation from the city of Dunkirk before the Nazis could annihilate them. The French army, like all the others up to that point, was cut to pieces by the German advance, which reached Paris in mid-June. A few days later, France surrendered. The northern half of the country was governed directly by the Nazis, while in the south, a collaborationist regime was set up in the spa town of Vichy, and is therefore known as the Vichy regime. In less than a year, Hitler had conquered part of Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The only major powers left standing in Europe were Britain and Russia, and Hitler had a non-aggression pact with the Russians. In July 1940, the Nazis began the aerial bombardment of England known as the Blitz. Between July and October, thousands of tons of bombs were dropped across Great Britain, from London to Ireland. Air raid warnings gave people enough time to get into the subway systems as a means of cover, if their city had a subway system, that is. The bombing at first focused on military targets and was dreadfully effective. A last-ditch effort by the British Royal Air Force, or RAF, that attacked Berlin changed the nature of the attack. An angry Hitler ordered civilian bombing to begin as payback. This shift in strategy allowed the RAF to rebuild airfields and fighters, which took to the skies and began counterattacking the German bombers. Great Britain also devised the first effective radar system to provide earlier detection of bombing raids coming from across the Channel. The combination of a rebuilt air force, radar, and effective anti-aircraft guns stymied the German assault, causing Hitler to abandon his plans for an invasion of England. The war wasn't restricted to the European continent. On the high seas, the Nazis revived the strategy of submarine warfare they had developed during World War I. This time, they sent out submarines in small groups known as wolf packs to disrupt shipping lanes to and from England. German subs even sank ships off the coasts of both Florida and South America. It took the development of sonar, the cracking of the German secret code, and the entrance of large numbers of American naval ships to finally turn the tide against the Nazi subs. Britain also needed to protect the Mediterranean Sea, and especially the Suez Canal, so supplies from far-flung colonies could still be imported. As a result, African contingents fighting under the British flag defeated the Italians in Ethiopia in 1941. British forces in Tunisia began putting pressure on the Italians, and after the fascists lost Tunisia, the Germans had to get involved. German forces under Erwin Rommel initially had success, but as the fighting went on, the Brits regained the advantage, finally defeating the Germans decisively at El Alamein in Egypt in July of 1942. In addition, the Brits teamed up with the Soviet Union to invade Iran in order to prevent valuable oil from reaching Nazi hands. The war was quickly spreading across the globe. Let's pause here for another review. First, Nazi Germany officially launched World War II with the invasion of Poland in September 1939, and within a year had invaded Norway, Belgium, Denmark, and had defeated France. Second, the Nazis then heavily bombed England in preparation for an attempted assault. But a switch to civilian bombing allowed Britain's RAF to rebuild and fight off the German onslaught. Finally, the war began expanding beyond Europe, as Nazi submarines patrolled as far away as South America. The British and Russians teamed up to prevent the Nazis from accessing oil in Iran, and the British defeated the Nazis in North Africa. Meanwhile, the war also continued to expand in Egypt. The Japanese not only invaded China, they also spread out across Southeast Asia, and by 1942 had control over large swaths of China, all of Southeast Asia, and island chains in the Pacific Ocean. They were also beginning to threaten Australia and India. The issue of expanding presented the Japanese with a dilemma. Japan had trade deals with the United States, including valuable scrap metal the Japanese used to build their fleet of aircraft carriers. If they antagonized the United States by expanding into the Pacific and evicting Europeans and Americans from their colonies, they would lose access to those resources. The need for other valuable resources like oil, rubber, and various metals available in Southeast Asia was great, though. And eventually, Japan chose to risk expanding. However, the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, could be used as a staging point for invasions of Japan's growing empire, and that could not be allowed. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese Navy pulled off a surprise attack against the base at Pearl Harbor. They caught the Americans completely unaware and sunk or nearly completely destroyed 8 battleships and took over 2,000 lives. However, the U.S. aircraft carriers, their most important ships, were either out on exercises or heading to San Diego for repairs and were spared. The Japanese also neglected to destroy the oil containers located on the base, which would have set U.S. efforts in the Pacific back nearly 2 years had they been hit. The Japanese believed the U.S. was decadent, and that if they strode over and hit the Americans, they would cower and not interfere with Japan's ambition. To say that estimate was wrong would be an understatement. The American people, who largely had wanted to keep out of the war, now rallied behind President Roosevelt as he gave his famous speech, calling December 7th, quote, "a day that will live in infamy." On December 11th, Congress declared war against Japan. For the second time, the U.S. was pulled into conflict. Back in Asia, Japanese expansion was finally stopped by a multicultural force fighting for the British. Japanese attempts to invade India failed, and they began to be pushed back. The US agreed with the British that the Nazis had to be defeated first, but that didn't mean no American activity was seen in Asia. The initial strategy was to train and equip the Chinese to fight back and weaken the Japanese forces. This strategy, though, failed due to the Chinese being more eager to fight the Chinese communists than the Japanese. U.S. sea power proved superior, as the American Navy won 2 major battles in 1942 at Midway and the Coral Sea, destroying the Japanese aircraft carriers and seriously hindering Japan's ability to protect their empire. It's time for another review. First, Japan began expanding into Southeast Asia and islands in the Pacific Ocean, but the American military base at Pearl Harbor posed a threat, so Japan decided on a sneak attack to take out the base. Second, the US officially entered the war after Pearl Harbor. They agreed the Nazis needed to be defeated first, though they sent an expeditionary force to Asia to train Chinese forces there. Finally, American naval power, demonstrated at Midway Island and the Coral Sea, along with a multicultural coalition under British command, halted Japanese expansion and began pushing them back. We'll return to the Pacific theater of the war later. For now, we need to see how the tide turned in Europe. In early 1941, the Nazis moved into the Balkans, gaining Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria as allies. Once Hitler had conquered Europe, with the exception of Great Britain, there was only one target left. The non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, in Hitler's mind, was only a stalling tactic, allowing him time to knock out other adversaries such as the French. It was in the East where Hitler envisioned conquering the living space Germans would need to spread their culture and supremacy. Therefore, in June 1941, the Nazis launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The initial surge against the Soviets was devastating, as the Nazis captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners and swiftly defeated any resistance. The Soviet army was disorganized and led by inexperienced men who had only recently been installed by Stalin, which explains the poor performance early on. Initially, the Nazis swept into what is today Belarus, as well as the Baltic states, before moving into Russia proper. The war in the East was savage, as each side meant to totally destroy the other. For the Nazis, the Russians were inferior, worth nothing except as enslaved labor. They brought the racial lens through which they viewed the world to battle against the Soviets. The cruelty inflicted by the Nazis was returned in kind by the Soviets, who were fighting an army that was invading their country and sought to eradicate them. So the Russians resolved to eradicate the Nazis first. Ideology also played a role here, for in Stalin's mind, Nazism was the most extreme form of capitalism, making the war in the East one not just of territorial acquisition, but also of ideas. Each side viewed the war as an existential one, in which defeat would mean the end of their way of life. Such a view led to the dedication and oftentimes desperation with which the war here was fought. While the German army was busy engaging Soviet forces, the rest of the Nazi Empire was attending to its primary task, serving Germany. The Nazis used every available resource from the nations they conquered or were allied with to serve their own ends. Taxes, food, and forced labor all benefited Germany and the German people, while many others across Europe suffered. For those people that had been conquered by the Nazis, a choice had to be made between resistance, acquiescence, and collaboration. Some areas were clearly split between those supporting the Nazi regime and those opposing, while in other areas the situation was much less clear. In southern France, the Vichy regime, often on its own initiative, sought out Jews for deportation to concentration camps. The regime also willingly changed laws to move more to the political right and be in line with Nazi regulations. Some ordinary French people simply kept their heads down, not wanting to run afoul of the Nazis, even if they secretly despised them. Others, when pressured, sold out Jews and members of resistance groups in order to survive. In Eastern Europe, resistance to the Nazis and their collaborators was much more open. The Polish Home Army, for example, set up underground schools, engaged in sabotage, and instructed people in how to interact with Nazis. In Yugoslavia, Josip Broz, nicknamed Tito, built a strong communist resistance to the Nazis. And in fact, his country was the only one in Eastern Europe to dislodge Nazi rule without the intervention of the Soviet Union. For some groups, though, resistance was barely even an option. Before we continue on, please know that what I'm about to discuss in this section and the images you'll see on the screen may be disturbing to some of you. It's okay if you find yourself having difficulties with this material or unable to get through this. If you are a current student of mine and you're having trouble here, please let me know. The last thing I wish for is to force someone via my presentation to revisit a trauma they may have experienced. In his work Mein Kampf, Hitler laid out plans for a racial war, directed against most non-Aryans, but especially against Europe's Jews. At first, once the Nazis took control of Germany, they evicted Jews from the country. However, as they were to pay the next year's taxes up front in one lump sum, many simply could not afford to leave. The Holocaust developed in stages, as the Nazis devised different strategies to answer the, quote, Jewish problem. The first step was the aforementioned eviction. As the Nazi Empire expanded, though, they found themselves in control of millions of additional Jewish people. One plan that was developed was to send all of Europe's Jews to the island of Madagascar, off the east coast of Africa. This plan, though, was too time-consuming and too expensive, and was therefore nixed before it even got started. Next, the Nazis established mobile killing squads called Einsatzgruppen. These squads followed the regular army units into newly conquered territory and were tasked with rounding up the Jewish population, along with any others the Nazis deemed undesirable, such as the Roma or those with physical or mental handicaps. Many of the men were shot on sight, while women and children were sent to forced labor camps. Any resistance resulted in death. It wasn't until 1941 that a series of death camps were created, and some existing work camps were renovated for the purpose of killing prisoners. This, quote, final solution led to a network of detention centers linked to various death camps by extensive railroad systems across Europe. In many places, more and more Jews were squeezed into already overcrowded ghettos to await deportation. Resources were scarce, and many died of starvation and disease before they could be shipped off to camps. The Nazis had been experimenting for years with various types of gas that could kill large numbers of prisoners quickly. Some of the testing, including the infamous T4 project, tested various chemicals on German citizens who were physically or mentally handicapped. The Nazis also used enclosed tents connected to the tailpipes of large vans or trucks and used the exhaust to kill prisoners. The death camps were constructed with large chambers in which dozens of Jews and others could be herded. With valves the Nazis would open to let gas in. Once those inside had been killed, the bodies were removed to crematoria and unceremoniously burned. Some historians argue the burning of the bodies served a number of purposes: to prevent disease from spreading, but also to erase any evidence of the crimes the Nazis were committing, and also to fully erase the victims, to make it seem as if they never existed to begin with. Initially, the Nazis tried to disguise what they were doing from their future victims. They would give prisoners postcards and tell them to write to their families that they were being transferred to the country, where they'd be given a farm and spend time growing food. Obviously, these postcards were simply discarded. Once a train arrived at a camp, a band would begin to play and people would celebrate the new arrivals as if they were about to begin a new, better life. These tactics were adopted at first to keep the prisoners docile. Soon, however, the Nazis abandoned the pretense and simply used violence, aggression, and intimidation to keep prisoners in line. The conditions in the camps were horrendous. The barracks were often shoddily built and drafty. The clothing prisoners wore was taken from them before they were killed and passed on to another group of prisoners. As such, it wore out over time and offered little protection from the elements. The barracks were overcrowded, which allowed for the easy spread of disease. Prisoners were forced to do hard labor in the camps while only being provided with roughly 500 calories per day worth of food. Men, women, children, the elderly, none were exempt from Nazi cruelty. Deplorable experiments were conducted on prisoners, including vivisections and the torture of twins. The conditions of the camps often stamped out any humanity the prisoners had coming in, as they began to turn on one another, steal from one another, and refuse to help others in need. There were nearly 42,000 ghettos, detention centers, and various types of camps set up across Europe. To pull off this level of industrial murder, the Nazis needed the cooperation of thousands of people. Camp guards, scientists, nurses to administer chemicals and assist in experiments, train operators, construction crews, office workers to handle logistics, and many others were required to make the Holocaust work. This raises the question of how much did your average everyday German know about what was happening to the millions of people being tortured and killed by their government? Though it's likely we'll never know for absolutely certain how many people knew and to what extent they knew, there were many, many people who participated in the mass killings, either directly or indirectly. Some took advantage of job opportunities, while others wanted to advance their standing within the Nazi Party, while others willingly participated because of active hatred of Jews, Roma, and others. Some people may have known what was happening, but simply chose to believe it wasn't, ignoring evidence and going about their daily lives in a self-induced ignorance. Some governments under Nazi rule, like the Vichy regime previously mentioned, took an active role in arresting, isolating, and deporting Jews. Other governments weren't as active but nonetheless did participate, while some were so slow to aid the Holocaust that the Nazis took over control of the government to pick up the pace. There was resistance to the killings from persecuted groups and others. In Warsaw, a major uprising of about 1,000 prisoners in the ghetto occurred in 1943. Resistors attacked Nazis with small, homemade bombs and a few guns they managed to obtain. In response, the Nazis burned the entire ghetto to the ground, killing 56,000 Jews. Resistance also took the form of helping Jews and others avoid detection. Families offered to shelter Jews in their homes and hid them from Nazis, often at the risk of their own lives. Government officials also helped. Raoul Wallenberg was a Swedish diplomat working in Hungary and put Swedish flags on the doors of houses to declare them Swedish and therefore neutral territory. He would gather dozens of people in these houses and try to secure passage for them out of Hungary. He also designed a new passport that, despite having no legal backing, was enough to get the Nazis to release into his custody anyone who had one. The efforts of Wallenberg and others like him saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. Many others weren't so lucky. As the Holocaust claimed 6 million Jewish people, 1/3 of the world's Jewish population, along with 5 to 6 million others, including Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and homosexuals. It is one of, and in many people's opinion, the most shameful moment in Western history. It's something we all must learn from, to see how far hatred and prejudice can go, and to work to make sure something like it never happens again. Let's pause here for a review of this section. First, once Hitler had conquered Central and Western Europe, with the exception of Great Britain, he turned his attention to the Soviet Union, launching a major three-pronged invasion. The fighting here was some of the most violent and desperate of the entire war. Second, resistance to Nazi rule differed across Europe, with some groups, such as the Home Army in Poland, having greater means and opportunities to resist than did others. Third, the Holocaust developed in stages, beginning with the eviction of Jews from Germany and culminating in the creation of concentrated killing centers. Brutal medical experiments, horrendous living conditions, hard labor, and Nazi violence characterized the lives of prisoners in Nazi camps. Finally, there was resistance to the Nazi system of mass murder. Diplomats like Raoul Wallenberg worked to protect Jews and others and to get them out of Europe, while Polish Jews in ghettos revolted against Nazi cruelty. World War II, just like World War I, was a total war, calling upon the entirety of a nation's resources to fight and win. Even nations that were not a part of the conflict still utilized natural resources for it. South American countries, for example, were neutral in the conflict, but provided valuable resources to the Allies and saw an economic boom because of it. The Nazis and the Japanese both benefited from slave labor, which not only saved money, but prevented their people from having to do some of the most grueling jobs. Every nation involved in the war used rationing at some point to concentrate available resources to the soldiers on the battlefronts. World War II was also a war of industry, and the key to winning was to simply outproduce your opponent. The Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan fared well in the early going of the war because they had ramped up production in ways other nations had not. However, once the United States entered the war, it became, in the words of President Roosevelt, the, quote, arsenal of democracy. Wartime production in America produced thousands of tanks, planes, and ships, millions of guns, and billions of rounds of ammunition. As the war dragged on, the production capability of the Axis powers declined, resulting in setbacks, retreat, and eventual defeat. Because of the importance of production, industrial areas became valuable targets for opposing forces. We've already seen how in the Blitz, the Nazis at first targeted airfields and industrial cities, hoping to cripple Great Britain's war effort. British and American forces returned the favor and attacked German industrial areas. Bombing, however, was dangerous, as there were always the possibility of being shot down by anti-aircraft guns or enemy fighters. The British and the US gave up the idea of targeted bombing, by which they would attack only factories and non-civilian areas, for the safer tactic of high-altitude carpet bombing of entire cities, including civilian areas. As the war progressed, even the Allies began utilizing the tactic of terrorizing civilians in an effort to end the war more quickly. The German city of Dresden, which had no industry and was a cultural hub, was violently bombed. And in the Pacific Theater, the Japanese capital of Tokyo was firebombed by the US, destroying much of the city. On the Eastern European front, despite initial successes, the Nazi invasion stalled out. The Soviets, who had been taking hit after hit, simply retreated east, in some cases dismantling and taking entire factories with them, and made a miraculous recovery. Soviet tank contingents began pouring out of Siberia and hammering the Nazis, who were worn down by not only the fighting, but also the weather and long supply lines. The turning point came with the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942 and 1943. A German army of 300,000 fought tooth and nail against the Soviets here, often fighting building by building. As soon as the city was in German hands, though, a massive Soviet army surrounded the city and cut them off. The entire German army was either killed or taken prisoner. It was a huge loss, one even the powerful Nazis could not overcome. After after Stalingrad, the Soviets began pushing the Nazis back, but the battles were hard fought and costly for both sides. By 1944, the Soviets had pushed German troops out of both Russia and the Balkan Peninsula, while Tito's troops in Yugoslavia chased out the remaining Nazis there. In 1945, the Soviet Union invaded Germany proper. Further west, meanwhile, the Allies had launched an invasion of Europe from North Africa. The plan was to move up the Italian peninsula, take out the fascists, then penetrate the Nazi Empire from there. However, fighting was slow through the mountains of Italy, as the fascists and their German allies had strongly fortified mountain passes and monasteries. Eventually, though, in 1943, Mussolini was overthrown and executed, and Italy surrendered. Joseph Stalin was calling on the US and British to launch an invasion of Western Europe in order to pin Germany in a two-front war and take the pressure off of his troops, who were advancing but taking appalling losses in order to do so. In mid-1944, the D-Day invasions took place as American, British, and Canadian troops crossed the English Channel to land in northern France. The fighting was hard, but the Allies gained a foothold and continued landing troops on the continent. They broke through the German defenses and expanded both east and west. East to deep water ports where large ships could dock and drop off supplies and equipment. West to Belgium and the Netherlands. By 1945, Germany was being invaded from both sides, and Soviet troops were fighting in the city of Berlin. Hitler committed suicide in a bunker underground, and the remaining German leaders surrendered on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was finally over. The war in the Pacific, however, was still raging. Initially, the U.S. strategy, as mentioned earlier, was to strengthen China and use it as a bulwark against the Japanese. However, that strategy proved unsuccessful, so a new strategy called island hopping was developed. This strategy saw the U.S. Navy and Marines make amphibious landings on strategically important islands in the Pacific, clear them of Japanese resistance, and use them as jumping-off points for the next invasion. This strategy proved successful, as the U.S. moved in on the Japanese home islands. The fighting wasn't easy, however, as the Japanese fought to literally the last man in some cases, defending lands they felt were theirs. As the U.S. got closer to Japan, the fighting only intensified, as Japan began using their own planes as weapons in kamikaze attacks against American ships, and the Japanese tried to kill as many troops as possible in hopes of making the toll of continuing not worth it to the Americans. The U.S. persisted, however, and military leaders drew up plans for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan. From 1942 to the end of the war, a series of conferences between England, the U.S., and the Soviet Union took place to coordinate strategy and plan for the future. At one of these conferences, President Roosevelt secured from Stalin a promise that 90 days after the war in Europe ended, Soviet armies would be sent against Japan. Stalin kept that promise, and 3 months after the Nazis had been defeated, Soviet forces crushed the Japanese army in Manchuria and prepared themselves for an invasion of northern Japan. Back in the United States, though, scientists in the deserts of New Mexico were working on the world's first atomic weapons. 2 bombs were shipped to the Pacific for use against Japan. On August 6, 1945, the first bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima, nearly wiping it from the map. Hiroshima was chosen because it was a communication hub, but 80% of the people there were civilians. The explosion wiped out nearly every building in the city, set the entire area on fire, and killed roughly 80,000 people, not including those who survived the blast but were killed by radiation poisoning in subsequent years. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped, this time on the city of Nagasaki, with nearly similar results. On August 14, 1945, Japan surrendered. The most devastating war the world had ever seen was now over, but the effects of that war would last for decades. All told, between 62 and 78 million people died as a result of the war. Many areas of Europe and Asia were physically destroyed, and it would take a massive effort to rebuild these war-torn areas. The horrors of the war would soon become known as news of the Holocaust spread. Many nations that participated in the war were fundamentally changed, and there was no going back to what had existed before. The political calculus also changed, as Western European powers would crumble, and the world was polarized between the two remaining, quote, superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The atomic age had also begun with the use of bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and atomic weapons would be a looming threat for decades to come, and are still a dangerous threat to our world today. It's time for the final review of this lesson. First, World War II was a total war in which industrial production was vital to victory, and the Allies having a greater long-term advantage. Second, despite initial success in the Soviet Union, after losing the Battle of Stalingrad, the Nazis began to be pushed back. First out of the USSR, then out of Eastern Europe entirely. The D-Day invasions led to Germany being invaded from the west, while the Soviets pushed from the east. Nazi Germany surrendered in 1945 after Hitler committed suicide. The war in the Pacific began to turn the Allies' way, and the US employed the island-hopping strategy to get closer to Japan. The USSR joined the war in early August of 1945, but by that time the US began using the atomic bombs it had been secretly developing. By mid-August, Japan had surrendered, bringing the war to a close. That does it for World War II. In today's lesson, we examined how the war began and progressed in both Europe and the Pacific, what was happening on the home front, how the war became a global conflict, and how civilians were impacted by the war. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below or send me an email if you're a current student. If you'd like to know more about the topics covered in today's presentation, here's a short list of books you can check out to get started. Also, if you're going to comment, please do so respectfully. You don't have to be a jerk to make a point. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all again in the next video.